Sometimes the weight of a promise is heavier than any weapon a soldier ever carried. Years can pass, generations can forget, but a vow made on the edge of life and death never loosens its grip. Promises like these are not written in contracts or carved in stone. They live in the heart, pulsing like an oath no battlefield can erase. There are men who return from war with scars on their bodies, and there are others who return carrying invisible burdens no one else can see. Walter Briggs was one of those men. For 47 long years, he lived quietly in a small Texas town, his neighbors knowing him only as the man with the dented old truck. Yet behind his silence was a secret mission, a duty unfinished, and a treasure of memory that refused to stay buried. On one ordinary evening, under a fading sun, he climbed behind the wheel of that battered GMC and set out on the final leg of a journey that began in the jungles of Vietnam. What unfolded was a story of honor tested, secrets uncovered, and a truth powerful enough to shake a nation that had forgotten. Stay with me, because once this tale begins, you'll find yourself holding your breath for the ending. And before we step into Walter's journey, I invite you, if this story touches you, if you believe promises matter more than time, to follow along, leave a thought in the comments, and keep watching for what lies ahead. The sun was collapsing behind the flat Texas horizon, pouring streaks of molten orange across the asphalt as Walter Briggs eased his battered 1962 GMC onto the narrow county road. The truck's frame rattled with every mile, each dent and scrape whispering of years that had tested both man and machine. Walter's hands, scarred and calloused, gripped the wheel with steady patience. On the passenger seat, wrapped in a piece of weathered cloth, lay a wooden box no bigger than a lunch pail. He had carved it himself decades earlier, each groove and joint locked tight without a single nail. Inside rested an object that had cost blood, loyalty, and silence. Beside the box lay a letter, its paper yellowed at the edges, though freshly sealed. The words on the envelope read, Precinct 17 Police Department. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, as if Walter had pressed his soul into every stroke of ink. He had written it the night before, sitting under the dim light of his kitchen lamp, each sentence measured, each word carrying weight. Tonight, that letter would leave his hands forever. The old truck rumbled past farmland lined with barbed wire. Dust rose in thin ghosts behind him, swallowed quickly by the twilight. Walter's mind drifted back to a promise he had made on a rain-slick hill outside Da Nang. He remembered faces, men who never made it home, brothers who had trusted him to keep safe what could not be spoken of. Every heartbeat now seemed to echo their voices, urging him forward. Up ahead, the glow of red and blue lights flickered in the distance. A checkpoint. The county line station had set up their evening sweep. Random stops, routine checks, nothing unusual in this part of Texas. Walter slowed, pulling his truck toward the cones. He saw the silhouette of a young officer step forward, flashlight cutting across the windshield. Evening, sir, the officer said, polite but cautious. Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle tonight? Walter's eyes shifted to the box. He let the silence hang for a moment before answering, his voice calm, low, but edged with a firmness that made the officer blink. I can't allow that. What I carry is police business. Silver Line protocol. The young man frowned. Silver Line? Never heard of it. You'll need to step out of the vehicle. Walter didn't argue. He opened the door slowly, boots crunching on the gravel. He stood taller than the officer expected, his posture straight, military even, his eyes pale and clear, fixed on the man without hostility, but with the kind of authority that made hesitation ripple through the checkpoint. Sir, I'm going to have to ask what's in the box, the officer pressed, glancing toward the passenger seat. Walter shook his head once. That's not for you to decide. My orders come from a promise older than your badge. The tension thickened. 2 more patrol cars rolled up, their lights splashing color across the quiet fields. Officers stepped out, hands brushing the holsters at their sides, unsure whether they were confronting a smuggler, a veteran gone senile, or something else entirely. Walter remained still, his hands visible. He offered no resistance, no sudden moves, but his presence, calm, deliberate, unsettled them. One sergeant whispered to another, "He's not nervous, doesn't flinch. Who is this guy?" The request for a search was repeated. Again, Walter refused, not in defiance but in devotion. He wasn't protecting contraband, He was protecting memory, honor, and the promise of fallen brothers whose trust he would not betray. The officers made their choice. Cuffs were clicked around his wrists, the metal biting against old bones that had known worse. Walter didn't resist. Instead, he allowed himself to be guided toward the back of the patrol car. Before the door closed, he turned once toward the truck. His gaze lingered on the box, resting quietly on the seat, as if even in the hands of strangers it knew it was safe. Inside the patrol bus, the hum of the engine became a steady drumbeat. Walter leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts stretched across nearly 5 decades, across jungles and fire bases, across friendships that ended in silence and blood. This was the moment he had prepared for. Every delay, every sacrifice had led to tonight. The young officer glanced back through the divider, his brow furrowed. "Sir, if you just tell us what this is all about." Walter cut him off gently, voice steady. "One day you'll understand. Promises outlive the men who make them." The drive to Precinct 17 was long enough for the sky to empty of light. By the time they arrived, the stars had claimed the heavens, sharp and endless. Walter stepped out under their watch, cuffs still tight, as the station's fluorescent glow bathed him in stark white. The truck remained behind, its engine silent, its secrets waiting. As the door to the precinct swung open, Walter felt the weight of the years settle squarely on his shoulders. He had reached the place where his promise would be tested. Whether these men believed him or not, whether they treated him as a criminal or a custodian of truth, he knew one thing with certainty. He would not let the box fall into the wrong hands. And so the quiet man entered the precinct, a storm of history walking through doors built for routine. The air inside buzzed faintly with the hum of fluorescent bulbs. Papers shuffled, radios crackled, and officers glanced up from desks, unaware that the next hours would alter their understanding of duty forever. Walter did not speak. He did not need to. The mission had already begun. The steel door clanged shut behind Walter as 2 officers led him through the narrow corridor of Precinct 17. The smell of stale coffee and floor polish hung heavy in the air. Radios crackled with the steady drone of routine calls, but as the man in cuffs walked past the front desk, conversations faltered. People looked up, curious. He didn't resemble the usual sort who passed through their doors. No slurred belligerence, no twitchy desperation. Instead, he carried himself with a stillness that unsettled everyone. Inside the booking room, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A young clerk shuffled paperwork nervously, tapping her pen against the counter as she studied the arrest sheet. She glanced at Walter, then at the officers. "What's the charge?" she asked. The sergeant shrugged, refused a search at county line, claimed police business, said something about Silver Line protocol. The clerk raised her eyebrows. "Never heard of that." Neither had anyone else. But what stood out wasn't the phrase. It was the way Walter had spoken it, as if it carried authority beyond their understanding. Fingerprinting came next. Walter placed his hands on the scanner with no protest. The machine hummed, capturing the ridges of fingers that had once gripped rifles and maps under jungle rain. A minute passed, then another. The computer screen blinked red. No criminal record appeared. Instead, a strange security flag pulsed across the monitor. The clerk frowned, tilting her head. "That's unusual," she murmured. "It's not a rap sheet, more like a restricted access marker." "What does that mean?" the sergeant asked. "Means his prints are tied to something sealed. Not local, not even state." The room grew quiet. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Walter simply stood there, calm, watching the process with the patience of a man who had expected this. Captain Reynolds arrived soon after. Broad-shouldered, seasoned, with the tired eyes of someone who had worked too many late shifts, he stepped into the room and studied the stranger. Walter met his gaze, steady, unflinching. Reynolds noticed the details others had missed, the squared shoulders, the slight stiffness in the walk, the measured tone of silence. Military. Not just a veteran, but someone forged in command. "Bring the box," Reynolds ordered. 2 officers entered, carrying the wooden container retrieved from Walter's truck. They set it on the evidence table with care. The brass lock gleamed under the light. Walter's eyes followed it, sharp as a hawk's, but he said nothing. "Open it," Reynolds said. Gloved hands worked the lock. With a click, The lid lifted, revealing the object inside. Gasps broke the silence. Nestled in velvet lay an insignia, unlike any they had seen before. An eagle, wings outstretched, clutching lightning bolts, but marked with a strange encrypted serial etched along its edge. It radiated the kind of craftsmanship reserved for institutions of power. Alongside it rested the sealed letter Walter had written. Reynolds slid it open and unfolded the paper. His eyes moved across the words, brow furrowing deeper with each line. Echo Shadow Unit, he read aloud. Firebase Horizon. Vietnam, 1975. Operation Silver Line. The younger officers shifted uncomfortably. To them, the names were just fragments of a forgotten war. But to Reynolds, who had studied military history, they rang like echoes from the margins. Rumors whispered about operations that never officially existed. He looked up at Walter. What is this? Walter finally spoke, voice quiet but resolute. It's proof. Proof of men who gave everything and were never named. Proof of a mission buried under secrecy while families waited in silence. It belongs here with the people, not hidden. The captain studied him for a long moment. He could have pressed, demanded details, pushed harder. But something in Walter's eyes stopped him. It wasn't defiance. It was duty, unyielding, heavy, sacred. Still, protocol demanded procedure. The insignia and letter were bagged, logged, and placed in the evidence room. Walter was guided into a holding cell, its bars humming faintly with the vibrations of the building. He sat on the narrow bench, hands resting loosely on his knees, gaze fixed forward. Through the bars, he could hear the murmur of voices. Echo Shadow? One officer whispered. Never heard of it. Must be some fake cover story. Another shook his head. Look at him. That's no fake. I've seen old-timers come through here drunk and ranting. This guy's different. He's steady. Too steady. The hours stretched thin. A pot of coffee burned on the warmer, filling the precinct with its bitter scent. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, rattling the glass. Inside, the tension grew. The letter and insignia sat in their sealed bags, waiting like sleeping giants for someone who could recognize their weight. Captain Reynolds paced his office, reading the letter again under his lamp. Words like classified, unrecorded, silver line, and fallen glowed under the yellow light. He rubbed his temples. Whatever this was, it wasn't routine. He knew better than to dismiss it as ramblings. Walter Briggs wasn't rambling, he was delivering. At midnight, the phone rang. Reynolds picked it up, his voice tight. Precinct 17, Captain Reynolds speaking. The line crackled, then a clipped voice identified itself. Department of Defense clearance. The officer on the other end requested immediate verification of the insignia's serial. Reynolds provided it, reading each digit carefully. There was silence, then the tone shifted. Urgent, precise. Orders spilled out. Secure the item. Secure the individual. Do not interrogate further. Do not release. A team was en route. Reynolds replaced the receiver, his hand trembling slightly as he set it down. The precinct suddenly felt smaller, its walls pressing closer. He looked out through the glass window toward the holding cells. Walter sat motionless, the embodiment of patience, as if he had been waiting for this call all along. In the booking room, chatter buzzed louder now, speculation bouncing between officers. Some thought he was a courier for classified intelligence. Others whispered spy. But one thing united them. No one doubted anymore that this was bigger than them. Walter sipped the styrofoam cup of coffee an officer had placed in front of him. He cradled it in both hands, steam curling upward. His voice broke the silence. Not to explain, not to defend, but to remind. A promise isn't kept because it's easy. It's kept because men trusted you when they had nothing left. That's all that matters. The young officer from the checkpoint stood nearby, uneasy. His face burned with guilt for cuffing the old man, but Walter turned to him and offered the faintest nod, as if forgiving him without words. In that moment, the room shifted. The officers stopped seeing a detainee. They saw a man carrying a legacy too heavy for most to bear. Suspicion gave way to a reverence none of them could articulate. The box, the insignia, the letter. They were no longer evidence. They were testimony, and the man behind the bars wasn't a suspect. He was a keeper of promises, waiting for the night to finish what daylight had hidden for 47 years. The station's hum of routine was broken at exactly 12:37 a.m. A sharp electronic tone erupted from the secure terminal in the captain's office, one that most officers had never heard in their entire careers. The monitor flashed a bright red banner. Priority access, Joint Command authorization required. Captain Reynolds hurried in, his coffee forgotten on the desk. He typed in his credentials, his heart pounding harder with each keystroke. What appeared on the screen made his chest tighten. It wasn't a local query, nor a state-level notice. This was federal, Department of Defense clearance, the kind that filtered down from the very top. The message was short but absolute. Secure the insignia and the individual in custody. Limit questioning. No external communication. Await federal arrival. Joint Chiefs aware. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his tired eyes. He exhaled, a low whistle escaping. This was no ordinary detainee, no crank veteran inventing stories. Whoever Walter Briggs was, whatever that insignia represented, it had shaken the halls of the Pentagon enough to wake men who didn't lose sleep easily. He called the shift sergeant into his office. No one leaves, no phone calls. That man in holding stays put. Understand? The sergeant nodded, tension stiffening his jaw. Out in the bullpen, whispers spread like sparks on dry grass. The old man's name, the box, the strange letter. Suddenly, they weren't just curiosities. They were secrets wrapped in silence. And every officer present felt the shift. Some leaned back in their chairs, muttering about spies and covert missions. Others grew quiet, watching the hallway where Walter sat in his cell. He hadn't moved. His back remained straight, his gaze steady. He looked less like a prisoner and more like a sentinel, waiting for something only he could see on the horizon. The young officer from the checkpoint couldn't keep his eyes off him. Guilt still gnawed at him, but now it was mixed with awe. He whispered to a colleague, he knew this was coming. Look at him, like he's been sitting on this secret his whole life, just waiting for tonight. Meanwhile, Walter cradled his coffee, savoring each sip as if the bitter liquid carried memories only he could taste. He noticed the nervous energy swelling in the room, the restless pacing of officers, the way their radios seemed louder now, though no one was talking more than usual. He spoke softly, not to boast, not to explain, but to ground the room in words that carried weight. Promises don't need witnesses to matter, he said, but sometimes when the world forgets, they need a reminder. His voice cut through the tension like a steady hand calming a trembling shoulder. Even those who had doubted him felt a pull towards silence, as if listening to a man who had walked further into the dark than they ever would. The insignia rested on Captain Reynolds' desk, sealed in an evidence bag. Its presence radiated an energy that unsettled him. He couldn't help but trace its outline with his eyes. The eagle, the lightning bolts, the strange coded etching. It was more than metal. It was a key, though he had no idea what door it unlocked. Around 1 o'clock the secure line rang again. Reynolds snatched it up. Precinct 17. This is Colonel Darrow, Department of Defense Liaison. Confirm possession of item and detainee. The voice on the other end said, clipped and sharp. Confirmed, Reynolds answered. Maintain position. Do not attempt to question him further. He is not your prisoner. He is under directive custody. Team inbound. 2 hours out. The call ended abruptly. Reynolds set the receiver down, staring at it like it might burn a hole in his desk. Back in the holding cell, Walter closed his eyes briefly. He knew the call had come. He had counted on it. For 47 years, he had lived with the certainty that one day the truth would rise from beneath the weight of secrecy. Tonight was that night. An officer approached his cell, uncertain whether to speak. Do you need anything else, sir? The sir slipped out without thought. Walter shook his head. No, what I need is on its way. The officer stepped back, realizing only then how easily respect had replaced suspicion. By 1:45 a.m., the precinct felt like a church before a sermon. The chatter had died. Radios squawked only routine calls from other districts. Every officer in the building carried the weight of waiting for something none of them had ever experienced. The insignia on Reynolds' desk had transformed from evidence into an artifact, its presence commanding reverence. The young officer sat near the cell, stealing glances at Walter. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, unsure. "If you don't mind me asking, why you? Why carry it all this time?" Walter opened his eyes, met the young man's gaze, and answered without hesitation. "Because I promised men who never came home. They trusted me with their last breath. When you make a promise to the dying, you don't break it. Not even if the world forgets they ever lived." The officer swallowed hard, the truth of it pressing into his chest. He didn't reply. He couldn't. At 2 a.m., headlights approached in the distance. Engines purred low, synchronized. 6 black SUVs rolled toward the station in silence. Their beams dimmed, their windows tinted. The vehicles parked in a precise formation. No sirens, no wasted movement. From the lead SUV stepped General Thomas Harrington, a man whose name carried weight in every branch of service. He wore no medals tonight, only a crisp uniform and the unmistakable air of command. His eyes were sharp, scanning the precinct with the speed of a man used to assessing battlefields. When he entered the station, silence fell. Officers straightened unconsciously. Even Reynolds, seasoned as he was, felt the shift of gravity in the room. "I'm here for Commander Briggs," the general said simply, his voice carrying the authority of both rank and history. Every head turned toward the holding cell. The old man rose to his feet. For the first time that night, his expression softened into something that looked like recognition. As the general approached, he halted, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a perfect salute. The room froze. "Commander Briggs," Harrington said, his voice firm but lined with respect. Walter returned the salute without hesitation, his posture flawless despite the years. In that moment, the bars of the cell dissolved in everyone's eyes. He was no prisoner. He was a commander, acknowledged at last. The general ordered the cell unlocked. Reynolds complied without argument. The insignia was placed back in Walter's hands, the weight of it like an anchor settling into place. What followed was not interrogation, but invitation. Walter and the general walked into the conference room, the door closing behind them. Radios were switched off, recorders silenced, maps and files were laid out. The insignia rested on the table like a relic calling its guardians home. Inside that room, history began to breathe again. The precinct clock struck midnight, its hand slicing through the silence like a quiet blade. Outside, the night air lay heavy, still and watchful, as if the town itself sensed the shift in history unfolding within the station's walls. Through the glass windows, beams of headlights appeared, gliding without sound down the narrow road. One by one, 6 black SUVs rolled into view. They didn't announce themselves with sirens or flashing lights. Instead, they moved in a precision formation, the kind practiced not for show, but for survival. Engines whispered low, synchronized like a single organism approaching its destination. The vehicles stopped in perfect alignment, doors opened in unison. Men in dark suits and crisp uniforms stepped out, their movements sharp, disciplined. They spread across the lot with practiced ease, establishing a perimeter without a single shouted order. The air seemed to tighten, filled with the weight of authority carried in silence. Captain Reynolds and his officers gathered at the entrance. The young checkpoint officer shifted nervously on his feet, realizing the night had escalated into something far beyond county protocols. The rear door of the lead SUV opened. Out stepped General Thomas Harrington. Even without medals, his presence radiated command. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, his eyes sharp and unwavering. He walked toward the station with the calm certainty of a man who had seen too much to be rattled by anything less than war. The general entered the precinct, and the room seemed to contract around him. Conversations died, chairs creaked as men unconsciously straightened their backs. Harrington's gaze swept across the room, not with arrogance, but with the authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect he carried. "I'm here for Commander Briggs," he said simply. The name struck the air like thunder. Officers exchanged startled glances. Commander. The old man in the cell wasn't a drifter, wasn't a suspect, wasn't a courier. He was a commander. All eyes turned toward Walter. He rose from the bench with measured grace, his back straight, shoulders squared. The years fell away in that movement, revealing the soldier beneath the wrinkles, the leader still alive within the quiet man. General Harrington stopped in front of the cell. Without hesitation, he lifted his hand and delivered a flawless salute. The room froze. It was as if the air itself paused to witness the moment. Walter returned the salute with equal precision, his eyes locking with the general's. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the decades between them vanished, replaced by the bond of men bound by the same code. "Commander Briggs," Harrington said, his voice firm, threaded with respect. "It's an honor to stand in your presence." The lock was undone. The door swung open. Walter stepped out, no longer a detainee, but a man restored to his rightful place. The officers around him watched in silence, many of them feeling shame prick their skin. They had cuffed him, doubted him, treated him as an inconvenience. Now they saw the truth. The insignia was retrieved from evidence and placed carefully back into Walter's hands. He held it not as a trophy, but as a burden, one he had carried for nearly half a century, one that was finally ready to be passed forward. "Conference room," Harrington ordered. The room was cleared, phones were silenced, radios switched off, windows were covered. When the door shut, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a precinct anymore. It was a war room. Maps lay spread across the table, files opened in neat stacks. A secure projector hummed to life, its pale glow washing over the walls. Walter set the insignia on the table. Its metallic sheen caught the light, casting long shadows across the maps. General Harrington leaned forward, his face solemn. "The insignia confirms what we suspected. Echo Shadow existed. It was buried so deep, most of my generation only heard whispers. You carried this for 47 years. Walter nodded slowly. His voice, when he spoke, carried both weight and weariness. "I carried it because men trusted me to. They died for it. I couldn't let time bury them." The general listened without interruption, his jaw tight. He gestured toward the insignia. "This is more than a symbol. It's a key, the serial code etched along its edge. Our analysts decrypted part of it weeks ago. It matches files declassified under Operation Silverline, files that trace back to Vietnam, April 1975, the fall of Saigon." The room fell into a deep stillness. The phrase carried too much weight to ignore. Walter's eyes hardened, memories flashing behind them. He didn't need to be told what those dates meant. He had lived them. Harrington continued. "Until tonight, Silverline was only half a story, a classified mission with no names, no insignia, no proof. We knew a group acted, saved lives during the evacuation, but there were no records. Officially, they never existed. You've brought us the missing piece." Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper, yellowed with age. He slid it across the table. The general opened it. Written inside were codes, sequences of numbers and letters etched with the discipline of a soldier's hand. "My son," Walter said quietly, "fought for years to unlock those codes. Colonel Jonathan Briggs. He never stopped trying. Before he died, he made sure I had them. He wanted this finished." Harrington's eyes flicked across the codes, recognition dawning. "This opens the microfilm archive embedded within the insignia." Walter gave a single nod. Names, details, the truth. The insignia was carefully pried open. Hidden inside, sealed against decades of dust and decay, was a thin strip of microfilm. It glimmered under the light, fragile yet indestructible in its importance. The general held it as though it were glass. This changes everything." Walter's voice lowered, carrying the weight of men who could no longer speak. "No, it doesn't change anything. It simply reveals what's been true all along. They were real, they were brave, and they deserve to be remembered." For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was heavy with the presence of history, with the ghosts of those who had been erased. The officers who stood guard outside the door couldn't hear the words, but they felt the gravity. The general placed the microfilm back into the insignia, securing it as though sealing a sacred relic. He looked Walter in the eye. "Tomorrow this reaches the president. By morning, every man of Echo Shadow will be named. Every family will know. The world will finally see what was hidden." Walter exhaled, a sound that carried relief, sorrow, and the release of 47 years. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his gaze steady. "Then my promise is kept." Outside, the precinct remained hushed. Officers stood at attention in the hallway without being asked. The young checkpoint officer pressed his back against the wall, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Inside the conference room, history had shifted. The midnight arrival had not just brought a general, it had brought recognition, validation, and the beginning of closure for a story hidden too long. The insignia sat on the table, its edges gleaming faintly under the projector light. No longer just a secret, it had become a beacon. And at its side sat Walter Briggs, not a prisoner, not even just a veteran, but a commander who had carried memory across nearly 5 decades of silence. The night stretched on, but the waiting was over. Tomorrow, the world would listen. The conference room smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee, yet in that moment it carried the gravity of a war council. Maps sprawled across the table, shadows stretched across the walls, and at its center lay the insignia, gleaming faintly, a relic long denied its place in the world. Walter Briggs sat with his back straight, hands folded before him, while General Harrington leaned forward, his gaze sharp, his voice low. "Echo Shadow," the general said, tasting the name as if it were a secret finally allowed to live in the open. Officially, it never existed. For years, the files were either destroyed or hidden so deep no one without the right clearance could prove a single detail. And yet here you are, Commander, carrying the proof in your hands. Walter's fingers brushed the insignia, his touch reverent. His voice was steady, quiet but commanding. "We were ghosts, sent where no record was meant to follow. Men who volunteered knowing their names would never be written." In April of 1975, Saigon was collapsing. Firebase Horizon stood in chaos. Families, allies, children, they were all in danger. Echo Shadow was sent to pull them out. 37 lives saved. 11 never came home. The room stilled. Even hardened officers who had heard countless battlefield tales found themselves holding their breath. The weight of unacknowledged sacrifice pressed down on them. Harrington's jaw tightened. "I read rumors once, buried in the margins of classified reports. Stories of a squad moving unseen, evacuating civilians through back channels when the city burned. But nothing linked it to reality until now." Walter's eyes darkened with memory. It was real. The faces of the children we carried, the screams, the gunfire in the alleys. Those aren't rumors. Those are scars. We lost 11 men that night. Brave men, brothers. And for decades, the world acted as though they had never drawn breath. His voice trembled slightly on the last word, not with weakness, but with grief honed by time. He drew a breath, steadying himself. "I made them a promise, that one day their story would not remain buried, that their names would be spoken again, that someone would remember." Harrington glanced at the microfilm now secured within the insignia. "This film, what's on it?" Walter leaned back, eyes closing for a moment, as if seeing again the jungle, the rain, the fire. Every name, every detail, mission orders, coordinates, the truth they erased. For decades, I kept it hidden, waiting for the day it could be seen without being silenced. My son fought for that day. Jonathan Briggs, Colonel Briggs, he spent years filing requests, demanding recognition. He died before he could see it, but he left me the codes to unlock what we carried. He left me the path to finish what we started. For the first time, Harrington's expression cracked. The stern general bowed his head, a silent acknowledgement of the son who had carried the same burden. When he lifted his gaze again, his voice was softer. "He'll be honored too. Every one of them will." The door opened quietly. Captain Reynolds stepped in, a file in hand, his expression pale. "Sir, we've received an encrypted communique from Washington. They want the insignia transported to Andrews Air Force Base immediately. They're preparing a presidential briefing." Harrington nodded. "Good. The sooner this reaches the Oval Office, the sooner justice is done." He turned back to Walter. "You'll accompany us. This is your mission as much as theirs. Perhaps more." Walter shook his head faintly. "It was never mine alone. It was theirs. Always theirs." The young officer from the checkpoint, who had lingered near the doorway, finally stepped forward. His voice wavered, but his words carried sincerity. "Sir, I cuffed you, treated you like a suspect. I didn't know." Walter regarded him for a long moment, his eyes steady, unblinking. Then he placed a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. Son, you did your duty. You asked questions. You stood your ground. That's what you were sworn to do. Don't carry guilt for following your oath. But remember this, sometimes behind an old man's silence is a battlefield you'll never see. Respect it. The young officer swallowed hard, his eyes wet, and nodded. Silence hung heavy after that exchange. Every man in the room felt it. Not shame, but humility. They had been granted a glimpse into a truth most people would never know. Walter rose slowly, his body stiff from years of labor and memory, but his presence filled the room. We have lived too long in silence, he said. Tonight, that ends. The men who died on foreign soil will be brought home in the only way that matters, their names carried into the light. Harrington stood beside him. And tomorrow, Commander, the President himself will say those names. The officers in the precinct, gathered quietly in the hallway, felt a shift in their own hearts. No longer did they see an elderly man in worn boots. They saw a commander whose life had been an oath written in sacrifice. The insignia was packed with care, the microfilm secured within protective casing. Harrington gave the order for the convoy to prepare. Outside, the SUVs gleamed under the parking lot lights, their engines idling in unison, awaiting their most solemn cargo. But before leaving, Walter paused. He looked around the precinct at the faces of the men who had doubted, questioned, and finally understood. His gaze lingered on Captain Reynolds. Take care of your men, Captain, and teach them this. Honor lives in promises kept, even when no one else remembers them. Reynolds nodded, his throat tight. Yes, Commander. And so, with the insignia secured, with the microfilm cradling the names of the fallen, Walter Briggs stepped into the night. The convoy surrounded him, but he walked at the front, his boots striking pavement with the rhythm of memory. For nearly half a century, the mission had remained buried, denied, erased. But tonight, under the silent stars, it lived again. The mission that did not exist had finally been spoken into truth, and its keeper, the quiet man from Texas, was no longer alone in carrying its weight. The night air carried a crisp chill as Walter Briggs stepped out into the parking lot, the insignia secure once more in his hands. The convoy waited, 6 black SUVs gleaming under the floodlights, their engines purring low like restless beasts. Men in uniform stood at precise intervals, forming a living corridor of discipline and respect. The precinct, usually a place of paperwork and weary routine, had transformed into a passageway between forgotten history and long-awaited recognition. General Harrington motioned toward the lead vehicle. Commander, you'll ride with me. We'll deliver the insignia to Andrews, then proceed directly to Washington. Walter stopped, his hand brushing the chipped paint of his old GMC parked off to the side. The truck stood out like a relic from another life, dented, rusted in places, stubbornly alive. He turned to the general, his voice calm but resolute. With respect, General, I'll drive my truck. That machine carried me through half a century with this burden. It belongs in this story as much as I do. For a moment, Harrington studied him. The request might have seemed absurd in any other circumstance, but here, tonight, it felt right. He gave a single nod. And the convoy will follow your lead. Walter climbed into the cab, the door groaning on its hinges. The interior smelled of old leather dust and the faint tang of motor oil. He set the insignia carefully on the passenger seat, beside the faint imprint left by decades of solitude. For the first time in years, the truck didn't feel empty. As the convoy formed around him, Walter turned the key. The engine coughed, rattled, then roared to life, its familiar rumble steady and proud. He placed his hands on the wheel, feeling the vibrations course through his bones. This was the road he was meant to drive, not in silence, but in honor. The procession rolled out of the precinct lot. Officers lined the walkway, standing at attention as the vehicles passed. Their eyes followed the old GMC at the front, their salutes sharp in the cold night air. Not one man moved until the convoy disappeared down the road, swallowed by darkness. Inside the cab, Walter's gaze fixed on the road ahead. The highway stretched like a ribbon of shadow, flanked by endless fields. Behind him, the SUVs moved in perfect formation, their headlights casting long beams that carved through the night. The insignia caught a sliver of light on the seat, gleaming faintly as if aware of its journey home. Walter's thoughts drifted back to Firebase Horizon. The chaos of that night had never left him. The sound of rotor blades chopping the smoky air, the smell of burning fuel, the cries of families scrambling for safety. He remembered lifting the child into his arms, pressing her small head against his chest as gunfire cracked through the night. He remembered the men who covered their retreat, men who stayed behind so others could live. 11 brothers who never made it out. His jaw tightened, the memory sharp even now. He reached over and touched the insignia lightly, as if speaking to them through the cold metal. "We're almost there, boys. Almost home." The convoy made steady progress toward Andrews. Along the way, towns slept in quiet ignorance, their streets empty, their lights dim. None knew the weight of the journey unfolding through their darkened roads. Only the rumble of the truck and the whisper of tires marked the passage of a story returning to the surface. At one overpass, a small cluster of vehicles had gathered. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. Civilians stood in the cold, waving flags, some raising their hands in salute as the convoy passed. Walter's eyes stung at the sight. He wasn't seeking recognition, but seeing strangers honor a mission they'd never known touched something deep. For decades, the story had been silence. Tonight, it breathed again. By the time the convoy reached the gates of Andrews Air Force Base, dawn had begun to creep into the sky. The horizon glowed faintly pink, the first brush of light after a night that had stretched long and heavy. Guards stepped forward, saluting sharply as the convoy entered. The base, usually alive with noise, seemed to move in hushed reverence, aware of the importance of what had arrived. Walter pulled the truck to a stop on the tarmac, its engine idling like a weary soldier waiting for orders. He stepped out, the insignia cradled in his hands. The wind swept across the open expanse, tugging at his jacket, carrying with it the faint roar of distant jets preparing for missions of their own. A small crowd of officers, airmen, and staff had gathered, drawn by the arrival. They stood in rows, saluting as Walter walked past. His boots struck the ground with a steady rhythm, echoing through the crisp morning air. Each step carried the weight of 47 years, each stride an oath fulfilled. General Harrington walked beside him, his presence commanding but deferential. "From here, Commander, the insignia will be flown directly to Washington. Tomorrow, it will be presented to the President. The names on that microfilm will be read aloud. Echo Shadow will no longer be a ghost." Walter's grip on the insignia tightened. His eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, young men and women, too young to know the war he had fought, yet standing in respect for it. He felt the past and present converge in that moment. The mission was no longer his alone. It belonged to all of them now. Before boarding the waiting aircraft, Walter paused. He turned once more to his truck parked nearby, its dents and scratches illuminated by the rising sun. It looked out of place among the polished military vehicles. Yet in its battered frame lay decades of loyalty, a companion that had never failed him. He raised a hand in a silent gesture, not of farewell, but of acknowledgement. The truck had carried the burden as faithfully as he had. In its own way, it too was part of Echo Shadow's legacy. Then Walter faced forward again, stepping into the corridor of officers who saluted as he passed. At the head of the line, Harrington turned to him. "Commander Briggs, the world is about to know what you carried, and tomorrow they'll stand in silence for your brothers." Walter inclined his head. His voice was quiet, but every man within earshot felt its weight. Promises kept are louder than silence. Let the world hear them now. The insignia was secured aboard the aircraft, but Walter carried with him something greater. The unbroken chain of memory stretched from the jungles of Vietnam to the halls of power in Washington. As the engines of the plane roared to life, the convoy stood ready to follow. The old truck remained on the tarmac, its engine finally quiet, its duty honored. For the first time in decades, Walter felt the burden on his shoulders lighten, not because it was gone, but because it was shared. The escort to recognition had begun, and with it, the final steps of a promise fulfilled. The following day unfolded beneath a pale autumn sun, its warmth tempered by the gravity of what was to come. The White House lawn had been arranged with rows of chairs, flags standing tall in the breeze, and a podium waiting beneath the seal of the president. Families filled the front rows, mothers with silver hair, wives grown older but still holding the weight of absence. Sons and daughters who had grown up without their fathers, but never without the hollow of their absence. Walter Briggs stood among them, dressed in a formal uniform retrieved from archives and tailored to fit his frame once again. The fabric felt strange on his shoulders after so many years of denim and work shirts, but the moment demanded no less. His back was straight, his chest steady. Across the lawn, photographers adjusted their lenses. Reporters whispered hurriedly, but Walter's eyes weren't for them. His gaze was on the front row where the families sat, their hands clasped, waiting for names that had been silenced for nearly 5 decades. The president stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. He spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of missions hidden not for shame, but for necessity, and of promises that refused to die even in secrecy. Then, with deliberate care, he opened the folder placed on the podium and began to read. Each name echoed into the cool air, carved into the silence with reverence. 11 names, 11 men, 11 shadows brought back into the light. As each name was spoken, a family member rose, tears marking their cheeks, their grief and pride intertwined. Applause never followed, only silence, heavier and more powerful than any cheer could have been. Walter's throat tightened with each name. He saw the faces again. Men laughing around a campfire in the humid jungle. Men singing softly to chase away fear. Men who had trusted him with their last glances before disappearing into the chaos of war. When the final name was spoken, Walter closed his eyes and breathed deeply, as though exhaling 47 years of silence. Afterward, he was called forward. The president shook his hand firmly, his other hand pressing against Walter's shoulder. "Commander Briggs, this nation owes you a debt it can never fully repay. Today, we honor not only those who fell, but the promise you carried for them. Without you, their voices would still be unheard." Walter answered quietly, his words not for the cameras, but for the families listening. "It was never about me. It was about them. Honor lives in promises kept, and I was only their keeper." Applause broke then, not the raucous kind, but the solemn applause of people standing to their feet, honoring both the dead and the man who had carried them home. The ceremony ended, but its weight lingered. Families approached Walter, one after another. A widow clasped his hands and whispered, "Thank you for giving me my husband's name back." A grown daughter pressed her forehead to his chest, sobbing, "I finally know my father was real, not just a story." Each embrace, each tear, chipped away at the solitude Walter had endured all those years. He absorbed it quietly, offering strength where he could, letting their gratitude wash over him without resistance. When the cameras packed away and the reporters drifted off to write their headlines, the true heart of the moment remained. The families lingered, gathered around Walter on the lawn. They brought photographs faded with time, letters written from the front lines, medals stored in boxes that had sat unopened for decades. Together, they built a mosaic of memory, piecing back the lives that history had tried to erase. That evening, as twilight settled over Washington, Walter rode back with the convoy. But instead of stopping at a hotel or returning to Andrews, he asked for one detour. "Take me to Mill Creek," he said, the small town where his journey had begun, where his truck sat waiting, where silence had once been his only companion. The convoy obliged. By the time they reached the outskirts, word had spread. Overpasses along the highway were lined with people waving flags, children perched on their parents' shoulders, veterans standing in salute. The old GMC led the way, its dents and scars gleaming under street lights like battle honors. For once, the battered truck wasn't just a curiosity. It was a legend, a war relic that had carried the weight of memory longer than most men lived. Walter drove slowly through Main Street. Shops were closed, but lights filled the windows. People stood shoulder to shoulder, clapping softly, not shouting. Respect replaced spectacle. He nodded through the windshield, acknowledging them, his hand resting on the insignia beside him. For the first time, he felt the burden lift, not because it had disappeared, but because the town, the nation, the world had agreed to carry it with him. At home, he parked the truck under the oak tree where it had sat for decades. Families of the fallen gathered in his yard the following Sunday. They brought food, photographs, and stories. Some spoke aloud, others simply sat in silence. comforted by being near the man who had refused to forget. Walter walked among them, listening, laughing softly at tales of youth, bowing his head at memories of sacrifice. His home became less a house and more a sanctuary of remembrance. On the dashboard of the truck, a small brass plaque was fixed in place. It read, "Keeper of Promises for 47 years." Visitors leaned close to read it, some tracing the words with their fingers. For many, it felt like a gravestone, not of death, but of a vow fulfilled. Walter himself never sought attention. He declined interviews, ignored requests for memoirs, and refused offers of book deals. He had never wanted the spotlight. He had only wanted the name spoken aloud, the family's given truth. Now that it was done, he allowed himself the quiet he had been denied for so long. And so, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, long after the ceremony, long after the applause had faded, Walter sat on his porch. The sun dipped low, the wind stirred through the trees, and the old GMC stood silent but proud in the driveway. He held a glass of sweet tea in his hand, his gaze on the horizon. For the first time in decades, he felt at peace. Not because he had been honored, but because the men he loved had finally been remembered. He had carried their voices across time, and now those voices belonged to the world. He leaned back, his lips moving in a whisper only the wind could hear. "We made it, boys. We kept the promise." The breeze rustled the leaves in answer, and Walter closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him like a final salute. The story of Echo Shadow had been buried for 47 years, but now it lived, in families, in children, in towns, and in a nation that had finally listened. Honor had outlasted silence. And Walter Briggs, the quiet man in the battered truck, had kept his word.